1996 Plymouth Breeze. Chrysler introduced its JA-body cloud cars in 1995 in the form of the sportyish Dodge Stratus and the upscale-ish Chrysler Cirrus. But corporate edict dictated the need for a Plymouth version. So what was left to do? The answer, the silly, ridiculous, designed by committee after way the hell too many martinis at lunch answer, was a value-oriented model with cheap wheel covers, a miserly body-color grille, and the smallest engine in the JA lineup. To its credit, the Breeze was roomy, more than decent to drive, and hella inexpensive, but it was also pathetically parsimonious. Basics like power windows and remote locking were high-lux options in the Breezyverse, while posh extravagances like a V6 engine and aluminum wheels weren't even available. One thing the Breeze did accomplish was to make the case for the redundancy of Plymouth, a storied brand that had been doing a thriving business selling Dodges with different grilles and taillights. Perhaps if Chrysler had followed that formula with the Breeze, we might still be driving Plymouths today. Instead, Chrysler killed off the Breeze and its entire brand in 2001. 1997 Acura CL. A poor ratio of expectations to reality lands the Acura CL on this list. Honda's luxury brand had established a tradition of great coupes, including the two-door Legend and Vigor, and of course, the standard-setting Integra. Acura promised to raise the bar with the delicious CLX concept, then dropped it on our feet with the production CL, which came across as a thinly veiled Honda Accord. Acura touted the CL as the first car from a foreign nameplate to be designed, engineered, and built in the U.S., but it seemed Acura's Americans were kept on a short leash. The CL was identical to the Accord in wheelbase, suspension design, height, width, track, bore, stroke, horsepower, and torque. Unfortunately for Honda, both of its brands had cultivated a core of shrewd buyers who posed an uncomfortable question. Why buy an Acura CL when you could get a functionally, and to a great extent visually, identical Honda Accord for 3/4 of the price? The answer revealed itself in the CL's crummy sales. 1993 Toyota T100. Given the thorough ass-kicking Toyota gave Detroit in the car market, we're sure American auto execs must have been shaking at the prospect of a full-size Toyota pickup, and shaking with laughter once they saw the T100. Toyota's Japanese execs, their egos no doubt buoyed by the success of the company's compact pickups, shrugged off the pleas of their U.S.-based staff and dealers that the only way to go on a full-size pickup was to go big. The home office was confident that a truck with an 8-foot bed and 3 across seating, built in an easy-to-park size with a miserly V6 engine, would dazzle American buyers with its Japanese efficiency. Boy, were they wrong. Instead, the feebly styled T100 looked like a 98-pound weakling just waiting for the domestic full-size pickups to kick sand in its grill. Toyota tried adding an extended cab and a supercharger to no avail. It wasn't until the company replaced the runty T100 with larger V8-powered Tundra that buyers began to take the idea of a full-size Toyota pickup seriously. 1996 Ford Taurus. It's hard to remember now what a big deal the Ford Taurus used to be, and we can thank the goggle-eyed freak that is the 1996 Taurus for that. The original Taurus was a revolution when it first came out in 1986. Futuristic, modern, and carefully built. It was the first American sedan that could credibly compete against the seemingly invincible Japanese. Ford stuck to the same basic formula for the redesigned second-generation Taurus, and wisely so. It became America's best-selling car for the entirety of its 4-year run. Still, Ford was sensitive to the flack it took for that car's derivative styling, so for the third-gen Taurus, Dearborn's designers changed things up. The all-new 1996 Taurus had oval-shaped headlights, an oval-shaped grille, oval-shaped rear window, and inside an oval-shaped center stack. Loyal Taurus customers said, "Oh, Val, my goodness, you expect us to buy that ugly thing?" Ford held on to its bestseller status for one more year by dumping half of 1996 Taurus production on rental fleets. But that was it. The Taurus lost its bestseller title in 1997 and never got it back. 1992 Jaguar XJ220. The XJ220 was easily the most anticipated supercar of the early 90s, and one of the biggest disappointments. It was first shown as a 1988 concept car with a 500-plus horsepower, 6.2-liter 48-valve V12, all-wheel drive, and a claimed 0 to 60 time of 3.5 seconds, this at a time when the 385-horsepower Ferrari Testarossa and its 5.3-second 0 to 60 run were really hot stuff. The auto show crowd went nuts, so Jaguar announced a production version with a $290,000 price tag, about $950,000 in 2024 dollars, and started taking deposits. In 1992, Jaguar finally revealed the production XJ220, except now the V12 was a V6. All-wheel drive gave way to rear drive, and the price had ballooned to £470,000, $1.4 million today. With 542 horsepower and a 3.6-second 0 to 60 time, the production XJ220 delivered on the concept's performance pledges, and by all accounts it was a pretty supercar. But it wasn't the supercar Jag promised. Depositors went to court to get out of their contracts, and Jaguar couldn't find enough customers to sell out the planned 350-unit production run. The company gave up after building only 282, with the last XJ220 reportedly selling for a third of list price. 1997 Cadillac Catera. Mired in its old man image, Cadillac needed a car to appeal to young sport luxury buyers who would only consider imports, so it did the logical thing. It brought in an import of its own, specifically the range-topping Omega MV6 from General Motors' Opel division in Germany. Perhaps GM figured that because Americans couldn't buy Opels, the rear-drive Catera would seem exotic enough, so they didn't bother with any visual changes save the grille. Americans, be they Caddy fans or not, expected a certain presence from a Cadillac, which the anonymously styled Omega lacked. Compounding the problem was the fact that Opels were never designed to be luxury cars, and the blue-collar Omega had no hope of outposhing upmarket German brands like BMW and Mercedes. The Catera had strong performance and handling chops, but it was completely devoid of luxury cachet. Instead of attracting buyers who would never consider a Cadillac, it gave those buyers one more reason not to consider a Cadillac. The Catera story does have a happy ending, though. Its failure in the marketplace cemented the need for distinctly styled Cadillacs, resulting in the spectacular 2003 Cadillac CTS and its successors. 1994, Dodge Ram van. Conversion vans were a big deal in the mid-90s. Witness the fact that Ford's freshly redesigned Econoline Club wagon won Motor Trend's Truck of the Year title in 1992. So there was much excitement when Chrysler revealed a new Dodge van for 1994, until we realized that behind that new bulbous nose was exactly the same van Dodge had been selling since 1971. No, wait, that's not entirely fair. The dashboard was from the van's previous refresh, which happened 16 years earlier in 1978. Even Chevrolet's van, also a 1971 design, but one that GM remembered to update once in a while, felt more modern than the new Dodges. Fuel-injected Magnum engines made the Ram vans quick, but nothing could hide their Stone Age origins and third-world build quality. After 9 years of so-so sales to what we can only assume were the stingiest of fleet managers, the Ram van was mercifully, if briefly, replaced by a Dodge-branded version of Der Sprinter. 1994, Saab 900. Back in the 1980s, Saab was a runaway success in the U.S., vying with Volvo and BMW as the yuppie car of choice. So, of course, General Motors had to kick off the 1990s by buying Saab and ruining it. The first serious sign of trouble was the new for 1994 Saab 900, the primary problem being that what was once Saab's most quirky and original car now shared its platform with Opel's sales rep special, the Vectra. Oh sure, the new 900 had plenty of Saabish cues, like that distinctive hatchback profile and the ignition key slot between the seats. There were even some new innovations like the fighter jet-inspired night panel, which darkened all gauges save the Speedo for distraction-free night driving. But Saab was known for its originality, and the new 900 made it painfully obvious that the brand had been absorbed into the corporate Borg. Even Saabophiles who had never even said the words Opel Vectra, let alone driven one, could sense the car's innate lack of Saabishness. The Swedish company's spirit was mortally wounded, and it wasn't long before the whole brand was history. 1993 Honda Civic Del Sol. When the time came to replace its much-loved CRX, Honda wanted to cash in on the success of Mazda's MX-5 Miata convertible, so the company tried to design a replacement that combined the traits of both cars. Imagine a device that combined the attributes of a drinking glass and a detective novel, and you'll get an idea of what a bad idea this was. The Civic Del Sol's Targa top couldn't put the wind in your hair like the Miata, while the extra weight and low-grip tires meant it couldn't dance like the CRX, and with its tiny trunk, barely large enough for the manually removable roof panel, the Del Sol also lacked its predecessor's legendary practicality. Sales were dire, so in '94 Honda tried luring buyers with the 160 horsepower engine from the JDM-CR XSIR. That didn't work. Honda decided the problem was the Civic moniker, so they shortened the name to Del Sol. That definitely didn't work. Sales continued to tumble, and in 1997, Honda killed the Del Sol, just like the Del Sol tried to kill the CRX's legacy. Happy ending. Honda kicked off the new millennium with a proper Miata competitor, and it was awesome. 1995 Chevrolet Cavalier. It's easy to heap dung upon the first-generation Cavalier, but the truth is it was an innovative and economical car when introduced in 1982. By 1994, however, it was rather ancient and sad. Unfortunately, someone at Chevrolet misread the design brief for its replacement, and instead of making a new Cavalier that was innovative and economical, Chevy made a new Cavalier that was ancient and sad. Although vaguely attractive in coupe form, the new Cavalier was awkward as a sedan and insufficiently engineered as a convertible. The driving experience was predictably miserable, with noisy engines and mushy handling. It felt as if the Cavalier had completely ignored the near takeover of the compact segment by Japanese cars, and few buyers outside the confines of Michigan took the Cavalier seriously as a competitor to the Honda Civic or the Toyota Corolla. Chevrolet followed tradition by building the second-gen Cavalier for a decade with minimal changes, and by the time of its 2005 Mercy killing, it was best known for its abysmal crash test scores. 1998, Daewoo, Lanos, Nubira, and Leganza. No doubt eyeing the success of fellow South Korean automakers Hyundai and Kia, Daewoo decided to bash its way into the U.S. market with not one but three oddly named cars: the subcompact Lanos, compact Nubira, and midsize Leganza, all oddball mashups of Opel and Holden. Their cheap prices were reflected in their cheap plastic cabins, which had all the ambiance of a bus station bathroom. Still, this wasn't a problem considering the target market. Instead of traditional dealerships, Daewoo's plan was to have college students flog them to other college students, buyers with no money, no credit, and disastrous finances, which made them just like Daewoo. Most of the cars were sold to the sales reps themselves, who later sued Daewoo when they discovered that their massive employee discounts had been reported to the IRS as taxable income. The experiment was terminated abruptly when the Daewoo conglomerate collapsed into bankruptcy. GM bought Daewoo Motors' assets, and the Nubira and Leganza went on to torment buyers well into the 2000s as the Suzuki Reno, Forenza, and Verona. 1990, Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme Convertible. Oldsmobile paced the 1988 Indy 500 with a slick-looking Cutlass ragtop, of which 50 were built for sale, then promptly recalled to the factory and destroyed. A few were hidden away and survived. GM cited vague certification issues, which may explain why, when the 1990 version appeared, it had sprouted a tremendous basket handle right smack in the middle of the car. What was that for? Structural rigidity? Definitely not, as anyone who has driven one of these floppy drop-tops could attest. We've always thought the bar was to give junkyard workers a convenient way to pick up the car and drop it into the crusher, but according to GM, the hoop provided anchor points for the door latches and the passive seat belts, because adding an airbag would have cost too much. At the Cutlass Convertible's press preview, GM told Motor Trend the car would soon get an airbag that would make the hoop go away. Instead, after 6 years of lousy sales, the whole car went away. 1990, General Motors Dustbuster Minivans. You've already read how two Japanese powerhouses failed to compete with Chrysler's minivans. Did you expect GM to do any better? To be fair to GM, its early 1990 efforts got the interior size about right, but everything else about the Chevrolet Lumina APV, Oldsmobile Silhouette, and Pontiac Transport was wrong. The design was supposed to be futuristic. Instead, they earned the nickname Dustbuster after the handheld vacuum cleaner they so closely resembled. It's hard to tell which of the three versions was the ugliest. The Transport, with its grooved plastic cladding tacked onto the Dustbuster's plastic body, gets our vote. But hideous styling was far from these vans' worst aspect. The 120 horsepower 3.1-liter V6 left them woefully underpowered. The mile-long dashboard made them disorienting to drive, and the anti-aider nose made them a pain to park. GM spent years patching up these odes to poor decision-making with bigger engines, shorter noses, and modified dashboards, but to no avail. All three versions remained failures in the marketplace, leading to their rarity today. 1991 Saturn S-Series. Saturn wasn't just one of the worst cars of the 1990s, it was one of the worst car companies. Brainchild of Call Me Roger Smith, now remembered as the worst CEO in General Motors history, the Saturn division advertised itself as a different kind of car company. Unfortunately, its first product, the 1991 S-Series, wasn't a different kind of car. Despite unique powertrains and engineering, it felt no different than GM's other front-wheel drive heaps of that era. Noisy, unrefined, indifferently engineered, and meh to drive, with build quality that was better than typical for GM but still not up to Honda standards. Saturn's innovative and expensive plastic body panels were supposed to enable frequent styling changes, but that never happened because there was no money left to change the styling. Saturn's all-new cars, factories, dealerships, and workforce drained GM's corporate coffers of some $5 billion, dooming not only the S-Series but most of General Motors' product lines to a decade of mediocrity. 1996 Nissan 200 SXS-ER. To understand how lousy the 200 SXS-ER was, you have to know how awesome its predecessor, the 1991-94 Sentra SER, was. Every car magazine raved about that 140 horsepower, 2,400-pound under-the-radar missile. In 1995, Nissan replaced the two-door Sentra with the swoopy but bland 200 SX, and we waited eagerly for the SER version, only to wish we'd never seen it. The Sentra SER's independent rear end was gone, replaced by a cheaper torsion beam, and although the powertrain was a carryover, the 200 SX's extra weight and bulk slowed the 0 to 60 time by almost half a second. The suspension was softened in the name of the two most dreaded words in the automotive business, increased compliance. And although Motor Trend's instrumented testing showed the 200 SXS-ER to have skid pad and slalom numbers superior to those of its predecessor, the magic that made the Sentra SER so endearing was gone. Why is the brilliant Sentra SER not more fondly remembered? Probably because the 200 SX SER was terrible enough to ruin the SER moniker for good. 1991 Toyota Previa. It seems rather ironic that Japanese companies could literally reshape what Americans wanted from their cars, yet creating a vehicle that could compete with Chrysler's blockbuster minivans was a seemingly simple task that continued to elude them. Witness the Previa, an egg-shaped oddity that came to market and immediately alienated most would-be buyers with its high price and pregnant guppy styling. Those who did make it as far as a test drive had another unpleasant surprise waiting. While most minivans had V6 power, the Previa was powered by a hopelessly overtaxed four-cylinder engine. We timed an all-wheel drive 1990 Previa all-track to 60 miles per hour in an excruciating 13.6 seconds, and EPA fuel economy estimates were barely out of the high teens. The Previa's mid-engine platform had no room for a six-cylinder engine, so Toyota added a supercharger, which only succeeded in making the Previa slightly quicker and significantly noisier. It took Toyota the better part of the decade to figure out that the only way to compete with the Chrysler vans was to clone them, which it did with the 1998 Sienna. 1995 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. The Monte Carlo had a two-decade run as the car of choice for gas station Casanovas before quietly being laid to rest in 1988. 7 years later, Chevrolet destroyed the dead Monte Carlo's dignity by attaching its storied moniker to this rolling travesty, which was actually the two-door version of the new second-generation Lumina. The problem was that Monte Carlos were known for their distinctive style, but the 1995 version literally had none. It was the epitome of the anonymous wheeled blob. From Maine to Oregon, grown men with mullets threw down their half-smoked Winstons in disgust and burst into tears. Even the supposedly sporty Z34 version managed to bleach out any personality that might have carried over from its predecessor, the passably credible Lumina Z34. Liberally slathered with the appalling mediocrity that was the hallmark of mid-90s General Motors, the Monte Carlo literally had no redeeming features beyond its ability to impart seats with motion. Amazingly, Chevrolet made no effort to address the Monte Carlo's anonymity until replacing it with a new version for Y2K, a car that was as ugly could be, but at least had some personality. 1995 Honda Odyssey. It wasn't just Toyota that got tripped up in its efforts to build a decent minivan. Honda got it wrong as well. A conservative company, Honda waited a full decade before going up against Chrysler's unassailable vans. Time you'd think the company could have used to thoroughly assess failed attempts like the aforementioned Previa, weird and slow, the Nissan Quest, too small, and the Mazda MPV, just plain wrong. Nope. Honda repeated many of its competitors' mistakes and made a few of its own, most notably eschewing the sliding doors so beloved by parents in favor of traditional hinged doors. Worse yet, this undersized oddity arrived just before Chrysler released a bigger and better version of its minivan, which proceeded to outsell the Honda Odyssey by a ratio of roughly 25-1. Honda flogged some to Isuzu, rebadged as the Oasis, and in return, Honda got the poorly built Rodeo to sell as the Honda Passport. It's difficult to determine which company got the worse end of that deal. If the Odyssey did anything well, it was proving that those who thought Honda could do no wrong were wrong. 1992 AM General Hummer H1. America's success in Operation Desert Storm turned soldiers into rock stars, leading to popular demand for AM General to build a civilian version of its military high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle. But Hummer H1 buyers soon discovered why the military offers such good benefits: to make up for the misery of driving around in a Humvee. Despite being as wide as the Panama Canal, the H1 offered next to no passenger space, primarily because its hapless occupants had to share the cabin with the engine. That engine was GM's utterly wretched 6.2-liter naturally aspirated diesel, which made up for its stupendous lack of power with an overexuberance of noise, though to be fair, it fought an exuberant battle trying to outshout the H1's moaning driveline and roaring tires. AM General tried to address the noise problem by fitting a gas engine, Chevy's venerable 5.7-liter V8, which only succeeded in making the painfully slow H1 even slower. When GM bought the Hummer brand, it figured out that the best way to sell Hummers to civilians was to spin them from civilian vehicles like the Suburban and Tahoe, hence the runaway success of the H2. 1995 BMW 318. Somehow BMW's American organization got it into its corporate head that it needed to capture its young up-and-coming customers at an even younger age, so it imported the 3 Series Compact as its entry-level model. Hitting the self-imposed $20,000 target price, about $36,000 in 2024, meant using a small 1.8-liter engine and ditching the E46's multi-link rear suspension for the old E30's trailing arms. And if you think this sounds like a bad idea, you should drive the car. The 318T couldn't even keep up with a Dodge Neon. Not the SRT4, but the ordinary Neon, which was more than a second quicker to 60 and cost half as much. Handling was fine, one of the few expectations the 318 met. But the ride felt as if the front and rear suspensions came from completely different cars, because they did. The silly styling, same wheelbase as the 3 sedan with a body shortened by 9 inches, apparently with a Sawzall, did it no favors. It took 4 years and a pitiful 25,000 sales for BMW to realize that a slow, ugly, ill-riding car did nothing for its brand image, no matter how cheap the pricing. 1991 Mercury Capri. Ford decided it needed a competitor for the MX-5 Miata, but instead of working with Mazda, a company that Ford partially owned, Dearborn cobbled together this wheeled mishap from parts bins all over the world. The car was based on the Australian market Ford Laser, which, ironically, was a reskinned Mazda 323 hatchback. The Capri was, poorly, assembled in Australia, and despite being marketed to young women, sold at old man brand Lincoln Mercury dealerships. Rather than follow what they knew about such vehicles, Ford execs went shoulder-deep into customer clinics, which convinced them that the most important attributes in a convertible sports car were comfort and practicality. That explains why, unlike the Miata, the Capri had front-wheel drive and a vestigial back seat. It also explains why, unlike the Miata, no one bought the Capri. We've always thought the car's name was misspelled. Move the R between the C and the A, and you get a much more suitable moniker. 1993 Volkswagen EuroVan. Volkswagen, having given America its first minivan in the form of the famed Transporter, probably figured it knew a thing or two about how to compete against Chrysler's all-conquering minivans. Volkswagen was wrong. The EuroVan was little more than a glossed-over commercial truck, and as a minivan it was too big, too heavy, and way the hell too slow. Its 2.5-liter five-cylinder engine mustered a mere 109 horsepower and 140 pound-feet of torque, and given the deadly combination of a steep hill and a stiff headwind, it felt like it might lose the battle to keep the nearly 2-ton EuroVan moving. Granted, VW had no problem selling slow vans to stoned hippies in the 1960s, but now that the me generation had traded their weed and tie-dyes for kids and IRAs, they demanded something better. Sales were so dismal that VW pulled the EuroVan after just 1 year. The EuroVan returned in 1999 with 6-cylinder power, but buyers were no more receptive. Compared to other minivans, even lousy efforts like the aforementioned Previa and first-gen Odyssey, the EuroVan's pitiful sales numbers looked like a rounding error. 1994 Ford Aspire. The Mazda-designed, Kia-built Ford Festiva was a runaway success in the late 1980s and early 90s, so when time came for a replacement, Ford and Kia figured they knew what they were doing. Instead of going back to Mazda, these two unlikely partners took it upon themselves to cobble together a bigger and more bulbous car using the same mechanical bits. The resulting Aspire drove as if it had been designed by first-year engineering students. The unassisted steering was slow and heavy, grip was lousy, body roll was outright comical, and refinement was non-existent. And this was just at city speeds, which was about all the Festiva's carryover 1.3-liter engine could muster for the bigger, heavier Aspire. Its interior was just as dire as that of its chief rival, the eternally dismal Geo Metro. But the Geo delivered better fuel economy and was, brace yourselves for 3 words we never thought we'd use to describe a Metro, better to drive. A quick test drive of the Aspire convinced most would-be buyers that they could aspire to something better, like taking the bus. 1990 Yugo Cabrio. This entry may seem unfair, as we've already roasted the dastardly Yugo hatchback on our list of the worst cars of the 1980s, but it seems that with the introduction of the new for 1990 Yugo Convertible, those evil geniuses at Zastava found ways to make the awful Yugo even more miserable for us greedy capitalist pigs. Instead of the simple manual top you'd expect on America's cheapest convertible, Yugo fitted a complex electro-hydraulic mechanism, one more thing to break on a car famous for braking. And although hardtop Yugos were finally fitted with fuel injection in 1990, the Cabrio made do with the old emissions-choked and impossible-to-tune feedback carburetor. Why? Because F you, American sun worshippers. If the goal of the Yugo's designers was to prove that the hardtop Yugo wasn't the turdiest car ever made, well, mission accomplished. American buyers, having been once bitten by the Yugo, took home fewer than 100 of these drop-top disasters before the Yugo organization imploded in 1992. Oh, and if you're wondering why the Geo Metro convertible isn't on this list, it's because compared to the Yugo, that rolling calamity is practically a Bentley. 1996 Suzuki X90. More than a quarter century has elapsed since we first scratched our heads trying to figure out what the hell, or why the hell, the Suzuki X90 was, and we've yet to receive an even passively plausible suggestion. Based on the popular Suzuki Sidekick, the underpowered X90 had optional four-wheel drive, but its passenger car tires and ankle-high ground clearance rendered it useless on anything more severe than a well-tended lawn. The X90 was also devoid of utility, having no back seat and a miserly trunk with barely enough room for the removable T-tops. Yep, that's right. This car of the 90s had the roof of the 70s, so it wasn't even a passable convertible. The exterior design looked like it was penned by a 4-year-old, while the cheap plastic dash inside clashed with the Crayola vomit upholstery. Suzuki polluted every car magazine with hyper-annoying X90 ads featuring eye-zapping red and yellow spirals and a headline that shouted, "What are you staring at?" To which we shouted back, "A stupid, pointless SUV that no one will buy." And we were right. Suzuki moved just 7,000 examples of this exercise in futility over a 3-year model run, which, by the way, was precisely 3 years too long. No question, in a decade that gave us plenty of bad cars, the Suzuki X90 is absolutely the worst car of the 1990s.